Hi everyone, welcome to AFI Docs 2020, presented by AT&T. I'm Adam Piron, the shorts film programmer for the festival. First, I'd like to thank our supporters of the festival, our presenting sponsor, AT&T, our AFI members, and you, our audience. We're here today with the filmmakers of Shorts Program 4. We have Laura Hinman, Director of San Diego, Mike Attie, Director of Abortion Helpline, This is Lisa, and Anders Hammer, Do Not Split. Just to kind of give everyone also sort of an idea of like the selection process of this year, we had over 1,000 submissions, and these are what we felt some of like the best short films that have been playing, not only just at other festivals throughout the year, but also just in terms of what we see as the cream of the crop of the short form documentary form that's out there today. We're super excited for everyone to be joining in and participating with us as we've been doing this festival online. And I'd just like to start off with a question, and I'll start with Anders, and then we'll move to Laura, and then to Mike. Yeah, I guess a question that I have a bit for all of you is, each of you sort of are like, with your film, embedded in a particular community that either you are a part of, maybe you're not a part of. And I guess I'm just curious how you sort of went about doing that, and like in terms of like sort of getting access to a lot of these stories and to these communities in particular, and also too how maybe they were a part of the process of you making this film. And Anders, in particular, I think about your film with the protesters in Hong Kong, and I'm curious how you came about that.
I basically went after the protests erupted last summer, so it's now a year ago since it started, and I went with the idea of trying to film the protests as close as possible, and I tried different options, but it became quite early very clear that the only proper option was to stay in the streets. So I've basically been out in the streets with protesters most of the time, filming a lot. And then you get to know people. It's not an easy place to call or to email about having meetings like you would normally do in some other places. It's a lot, people are very cautious about how they communicate. It's all through these apps, with encrypted apps. But still, people will be skeptical to meet someone new like me. So I basically spent time in the streets and got to know people that way, and followed specific protesters for a very long time. And then, of course, it gets easier when you get to know people. But it's been a very shifting situation, and at times very, very dramatic also, with all the fights and arrests and things flying through the air. So it's been really a very tense period where I would normally not know what I was going to film. So I sort of clinched onto my camera, and you can see the result in the movie.
Yeah, thank you. Laura, how about yourself? In particular, like with your film, it's like such a collage of, I think, this moment in particular, and also kind of like life right before this. And I'm curious how within sort of San Diego, and then even like your own community, how you sort of went about, getting access to a lot of these places, or even like, some of the powwows that are and dancing that's taking place online, how you kind of went about all of that, and, and even how your community plays a role in terms of how you made this film.
I always have fun filming because I'm always filming my friends or my family, and that's basically how everything starts. Like I just am filming all the time with my phone or with like a camcorder or anything that I can find. So I'm always trying to film, and so my friends and my family are pretty annoyed at this point. But for me, it works out good because they're kind of used to being on camera. They're kind of used to, I never ask them to like act anything out or repeat things, but I think a lot of the times people get uncomfortable around cameras. But I'm lucky because I kind of like condition my friends and family, you know, just by filming every day and just by introducing them to the idea of like direct cinema, and kind of like situations that they might not think are worthy of filming or worthy of documentation. But for me, it's like, this is exactly what I want to film, just like everyday moments, funny things, sad things, whatever it is. And a lot of that got, a lot of my plans and a lot of things, you know, like everybody else, it got put on hold for quarantine. And so then I just took to like recording my screen, because a lot of people were sharing like how they're dealing with quarantine and how they're dealing with not being able to gather and not being able to, you know, have these traditional times of dancing together or playing games together, whatever it is. Like, they're doing it all online. So I basically found all these clips through my friends and family. Again, like, they just share things, and um, I want to share it through them, I guess. So it's through my community's voice and through my own voice. And I like how everything's layered in that way.
That's great. Thank you. Mike, how about yourself in particular with, you know, the organization and, you know, sort of getting access to like some of the callers that were calling in?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So the backstory of this film is that, so it was made in collaboration with two other filmmakers. It's Janet Goldwater and then Barbara Attie, who's also my mother and has been a filmmaker since I was very small. And they had been making films, Janet and Barbara, about reproductive rights for a long time. In fact, they made their first film together about this, I think, when I was about 10 years old. So it's something that I've always kind of grown up with myself. So they were really interested in doing something that would kind of like respond to what they felt was like a real threat to reproductive rights, especially after the election of Trump. And they had a connection. They knew about this organization, Women's Medical Fund. And so it wasn't actually that difficult for them to get access to the organization, because they've been known for a really long time as filmmakers who are on the front lines of this issue and are real advocates for reproductive rights. The more interesting thing was thinking about the calls themselves. So, you know, the film is very simple. You're just seeing the operator answer the phone calls, and then you hear their voice on the other end. We had tried initially shooting without hearing the caller's voice, just hearing the operators, but it didn't work. You really needed that. And as you started to just be in the room and hear the voice on the other end, you realize the story really lay in there. So we constructed basically like a kind of a release, a statement that they could agree to that was read by one of the operators when the call began, asking them, you know, are they willing to participate in this documentary? No information that would reveal who they were would be revealed in the course of the film. And, you know, in the course of asking that, I would say about maybe 70% of the callers said yes and agreed, 30% said no. And then after we completed the film, you know, we had a lawyer look through it. We had the organization look through it and make sure that there were no sort of identifying details within it.
We also have Matthew Salton, director of Patty, Are You Bringing Weed In from Jamaica? Matthew, I think also sort of asking a similar question to what I was asking the other filmmakers is, in terms of sort of getting access to the story that you did, and in terms of like working with Patty, how did you go about that? And how did you, you know, was Patty a part of the process of you making this film in terms of, you know, sort of the final word, you know, kind of the final edit?
I first met Patty through a friend who was working on a weed farm in California. She had lived there, and she met Patty there and was telling me about her and saying, I met this amazing woman. She's the first woman possibly to bring in weed into the US. She's a total badass. And I thought, oh my God, I got to meet this woman. And she said, well, I don't know if I'm comfortable giving you her phone number. You know, I don't know if she wants to be filmed or whatnot. But I showed her my other films and said, you know, maybe I can just have a chat with her and see what she says. So I called Patty and talked with her, and she was totally open. She said, you know, I'm at the point in my life where I'm ready to tell my story. And, you know, if you want to do something, let's meet. So I flew out to California and met her. And yeah, she was open and excited to talk.
The next question I'd like to ask would be, in terms of capturing a lot of the footage, at what was your process in terms of sort of finding the story? And Anders in particular, I think like with yours, I would imagine, you know, kind of to what you said before, where you knew about the situation going on, you went, and I would assume that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it was just sort of like a lot of live filming as it was happening. But I'm wondering, like, kind of in the edit, at what point did you essentially sort of lock, or did you sort of like hone in on what this story in particular was?
All through the summer and the autumn, the situation was escalating, and you could really feel that in the street, that this was getting more and more intense. So I was aware of that, but still I was filming basically all the time, almost every afternoon and evening, because a lot of these things happened at night time, as you also can see in the movie. And then when we went to the edit, we saw the story through specific sequences on dates. You can see the dates in the movies, and I think it illustrates certainly only a small part of what happened in Hong Kong, but I think we can see the direction about how it developed from having smaller gatherings and also fights in the streets, to having these really big battles at the universities for days. And that was super intense. I've covered a lot of conflicts before. I lived in Afghanistan for 6 years, and also worked a lot in Iraq and Syria. So I have quite a lot of experience from filming war. This was very different. This was demonstrations and thousands of people walking out in the streets, often small kids and older people were joining as well. But at times it was very, very violent. So of course we could only pick a very, very small part from the material. But I wanted to show the escalation and also the growing concerns and also desperation, and maybe hope, which was also changing through the months.
Laura, how about yourself? I know with your film in particular, it sort of takes a very sort of like collage-like approach in terms of the footage, and I think in terms of also like with how you were gathering the footage. I'm curious, in terms of your editing process, like how did you go about it? And same thing, like how did you kind of find, you know, what your story was through everything that you were working with?
I always start a project based off of some like strong emotion that I just want to get out. You know, this time it's kind of like starting at the beginning of quarantine, so I was feeling very angry and feeling very confused and kind of desperate, you know. So I feel like I started editing out of this like really frantic, almost like a panic place. And so I think a lot of the pieces come together that way, because that's how I was feeling. And you know, it's like fragments of 1 minute it feels okay and like I feel hopeful, and then the next it's I don't know what's going on, I have no control. These types of going back and forth, and that's kind of just how I pieced it all together. A lot of it is based off of like quarantine and what was happening with certain people protesting quarantine, and then going back to my feelings about protesting at Standing Rock, and how, you know, there's differences between standing up for things and you know, it's fueled between like America and also Native America, and like different perspectives on how this time period is affecting Americans versus Native Americans. So
Thanks. Mike, how about yourself? I think in particular too, also like, you know, I think in some ways it makes sense in terms of like going into that organization and sort of like its mission in a lot of ways is sort of like what you're highlighting. But I'm curious, like, did you find sort of a different angle from what you guys were maybe sort of going in for? Or I guess kind of, and if not, just sort of in general, like how did you sort of find the story overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we had started it, we probably had envisioned something bigger in a sense, or more filled out in terms of understanding what the Hyde Amendment is and where that's all going. And so there are many other things that we had filmed along the way. There's a current movement in Pennsylvania now to overturn it because it's very much of a state-by-state decision. But as we got into it, we really ended up like stripping it down a lot. I think at some point, you know, with any of these films, there are always these longer versions of it. There was probably a 30-minute version that had a lot of the information in it. And then what we found was it was more satisfying and useful to really just get down to what are the different complications that women are dealing with along the way as they try to like navigate all of this. And then what are the voices in Washington that to me feel very disconnected from it all? What are they saying at the same time? So for us, it was mostly about just getting like a couple snapshots of what a woman's experience was. And not just like, I think what was most striking for me about it in working on the film, especially, was just seeing the numbers of it. I became very kind of obsessed almost by the numbers and seeing what small amounts of money we were actually talking about. You know, so when the operator is talking to a woman and kind of like going through her monthly expenses and figuring out where she can cut corners to maybe get enough money for this abortion, you're realizing it's like $25, $50, like money that I don't think a lot of us really even think about, that's so critical to these women. And that became a lot of the focus of the film too, is just finding like those, just showing like what it really feels like to live on the fringes. One interesting thing that came as a result of that, though, is people would watch the film and then immediately like want to make a donation. And so I remember when we were mixing the film, like the sound mixer, after he immediately made a donation to the organization. And then like the person who was designing the poster immediately made a donation to the organization. And the organization contacted us because they're like, there are all these random donations coming in. We haven't solicited for anything, and they just keep on coming in. It was all these people who had just encountered the film and felt compelled to give like $20.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Matthew, how about yourself? I mean, I think, you know, obviously there's sort of the story of Patty and what she was doing, but the same thing, I guess, kind of like, did you find a different story or a different angle kind of like once you were sort of in the edit, or kind of at least like interviewing her?
Yeah, you know, I wasn't very interested in marijuana per se, but when I met her, it was kind of just seeing the energy she had and the way she told the story. It was more about her as a businesswoman. And I thought at the beginning, okay, the take is going to be kind of a woman as entrepreneur story, like in this man's world, the industry of marijuana trafficking. But in the end, I think it kind of turned into something more about how, or the way I see it is like Patty as a messenger, bringing in this substance, this plant into the US, something that informed a lot of the counterculture in the 60s, the music, and how she played a small role in this, you know. And the ending, adding the part with Woodstock, was kind of a last minute thing where it kind of just showed her legacy and the small part she played in the 60s. She told me later that, you know, Jimi Hendrix smoked some of the marijuana she brought in from Jamaica that weekend that he performed at Woodstock. So I think that kind of brings it together at the end, kind of about the small role she played in a bigger movement.
Yeah, thank you. It's a question that I have for all of you. This will be the last question. In terms of with your projects in particular, and I know, you know, maybe some of you have done features, maybe some of you haven't. You know, one of the things I'm always curious about is not necessarily like why a short, but I think more in particular, like how did you find that the short form in particular helped you tell this story versus like if it would have been a feature? Anders, I'll start with you.
I think it's a very open form. I feel freer when I'm working on a short than a longer one, so you can experiment. I've made this in collaboration with a film company, Field of Vision in New York. And I worked with them before, and they are specializing in short documentaries. So I knew from the start when started working with them on the Hong Kong project that this would be a short. I basically feel free working on the format, and maybe that's also my problem, because I've been doing quite a few investigative journalism programs in Norway, and that would be normally like 55 minutes for TV. It's equivalent to Panorama on BBC in the UK. So I know that format pretty well, and it feels very different to work on the shorts, but I think the situation in Hong Kong was very unpredictable. I didn't know, and no one knew where it was heading. It was just a lot happening at the same time. Very, very dramatic and intense months, and now a year. So I like the format in the way that you can just follow the development, and I feel free.
Great, thank you. Laura, how about yourself? I think in particular too, sort of working, you know, I know that you've in the past, you've done some sort of like longer, shorter films, but I guess I'm curious in particular with this, you know, there's a certain urgency in terms of what you're showing and in terms of what you're exploring, but I'm also curious like how the short form in particular helped you tell this story.
Well, for me, I feel like my whole philosophy is like don't follow any rules. And so like a lot of the time when I start something, I just keep it to myself. I hold on to the project for the longest time for no reason, because I'm scared to share it or something like that. But this time I was just like, you know what, I'm going to put it out. I just put it on, you know, the internet and allowed people to get a view of it, because that's what the point is. You know, I want people to react to it, and it's about right now, about these times. So I would hope that people watch it and feel a little bit less isolated or alone when they watch it, just because that's what it's meant for, and that's what it's kind of about. And I don't know, short, it just feels like if you have that amount of time and you need to say something, then just say it. So that's how I approached it.
Thanks so much. Mike, how about yourself as well?
Yeah, I've worked.
It's such a huge sort of topic, and you know, you get into a lot of the legislation and stuff too. And I think you guys, you and your co-directors all handled it in a very sort of like masterful way. And I guess, yeah, I'm curious, you know, by you know, kind of like what about the form sort of lent itself or its strengths to your story?
I think you know, I've worked in both, and I agree with the other two filmmakers that there's something like really nice about working in a short where you're not. I think with a feature, you're often feel like you're beholden to get through like a certain level of exposition, and not only that, but I feel like in the production process and the promotion process, it's this really long, drawn out thing. And there was something really nice about just like having this feature, this short done, and getting it out into the world. And I think for us, it's so much about raising awareness of the issue, and that little 10 minute, you know, 12 or 14-minute film, sorry, it's so like viewable online. I think people can get a lot from watching it in a really short period of time. I think if it were any longer, it might be harder to hold somebody's attention. I just like the idea that, you know, that people could go and encounter this on like Vimeo or YouTube or wherever it ends up, and really feel like they've learned something and gained something and experienced something and understood, like, I think understood, you know, how terrible this legislation is. So I don't know. I think that for me, a lot of it, this particular short, a lot of it really is about kind of like the end game of where it's going to end up.
Thank you. And Matthew, how about yourself? I mean, I think in terms of, you know, specifically telling this story and sort of, you know, covering sort of like Patty's adventure specifically in this time, what about the short form in particular lent itself to the story? I mean, because I think you could very easily see a feature version of this, and yeah, I mean, I think it works really well as a short too. So I'm curious about like what with the, you know, the strengths of the form lent itself to this story in particular.
Yeah, I mean, she had so many stories. you know, she married her boyfriend, John, and he ended up having his own career later on when she, you know, became a mother, you know, where she was hanging with the Rolling Stones, living at the Plaza Hotel. So she had tons of crazy stories. And I really just wanted to focus on the Jamaican aspect of it and her life in Florida. And like everyone else is saying, you have to get into more exposition and the technicalities, and the technicalities of the weed trade didn't really interest me as much. It was more about her as a person and her energy. So even in the film, you know, I kind of glossed over how she exactly went to the island and transferred it, and, you know, kind of skimmed over a lot of that stuff just to kind of create this fast-paced energy, something quick, fun, people could watch. That was really more about her and her energy and what she brought to it, and the recklessness, or how she had no fear in doing this. And yeah, so I think if it was longer, then you would need to get into more kind of the technicalities of how people were bringing weed into the States and what that involved.
Yeah, thank you. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for being here today. You know, for all of you tuning into this, tell your friends. This program is available until June 21st. We'd love to hear from you on social media at #AFI Docs. And join us for more great films and virtual events at docs.afi.com. Thanks everyone for being here. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the shorts programs as well.